live. Should be any second, and we're live. That was quick from StreamYard. I am live. We're live on a Friday evening, morning, whatever time it may be, depending on what part of the world you are tuning in from. We have an incredible show tonight. So for people that may be wondering, I have brought along, well, everybody here is on the panel is a friend of mine. I've known Bob for many years. I've known John for many years, Dr. Price. Subdeacon Daniel's a near and dear friend. Father is a friend as well. We're going to be talking about the virgin birth, the incarnation. Is it reasonable to believe? And of course, I know that the two men to my right definitely are going to say no. I know John's going to say no. Bob, I know Dr. Price is going to say no. And the brothers I've got down below, I know that they are going to say, without a doubt, yes. So I can't wait to have robust dialogue here. But before we even dive in, I want to let the people get to know you all a little bit. John, my friend, introduce yourself to the audience. What do you do? And you let the audience know a little bit about yourself.
I am a former Catholic who was raised in a local church, confirmed, and I had a Easter type of relationship with him. And then I had a dramatic conversion in the early 70s to Jesus. And he warmed my bosom, and I decided I want to know more about him. So I went to college, and I went to seminary, and I went to Jesuit school. They'll recognize that. And I decided I wanted to, understand my faith, see. But what happened in the long and the short of it is that my studies ended my faith. It's just the fact. I had some experiences along the way, but sometimes you need bad experiences to wake you up because the delusion is that strong. And I decided at that point to tell people what I thought, and they pushed back. So I kept writing, and they kept pushing back. I kept writing, and they pushed back. So long and the short of it, I've written or co-edited or edited about 13 books, not self-published, but published books, and reputed publishers. Prometheus Books is ranking atheist publisher in our generation, and now I go around and speak, and I write essays at Secular Web, of which on this topic I've written one called "Hail Mary, was Virgin Mary truly the mother of God's Son?" So that's going to be published in the next few days, actually. So that's about me, and if you want to read further, apart from what you hear today, you can go there.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And I do want to plug that in for people that may think that it is odd that a theist be plugging these books, and I recommend you get a hold of them, because in my opinion, the material that John and Bob put out, Dr. Price, excuse me, I'm used to calling him Bob because he's a friend of mine, but I want to be respectful to his title. John and Dr. Price, I believe that they're top-notch, and I believe that if you are evangelical, Catholic, Orthodox, I don't care. I think that they're very worthy of getting a hold of, understanding where they're coming from, rather than misunderstanding and being able to engage with their work. That is very key. And I think that, hey, if you are confident of your faith, there's nothing to worry about when it comes to that. And indeed, as I've told people for many years, I am very well acquainted with all of John's books. I have them even on Audible, and I enjoy them very much. Dr. Price, my friend, who are you? Let the audience know a little bit about yourself.
Well, as you can tell, I'm a nut, neurotic, a weirdo, comic book fan who never grew up. And I feel like there's no point in putting away childish things. It's to me, it is being interested in fantasy, science fiction, horror, superheroes, and all that just keeps the sense of wonder going. And I think it's all modern mythology, which is a good thing, not a bad one. And I guess I was sort of passively Southern Baptist, as my parents were when I was a kid in Mississippi. When we moved to New Jersey, I was 10, I guess, that's right. And we started going to a conservative Baptist Association church. And they had pulled out of the American Baptist Church during the fundamentalist modernist controversy. Well, I got heavily involved in that and was reading the Bible, having devotions, go to church at least 3 times a week, active in the youth group, witnessing to people and all this, and just couldn't say enough about it. Though I also found it frustrating and sometimes depressing. I guess I kind of took it a little too seriously in some ways. But I was real pleased with evangelical Christianity and apologetics and Christian cultural writings. And I thought, yeah, this is a real world view, and I'm pleased to espouse it. But like John, the more I began to read, especially some of the authors they suggested one not read in order to preserve one's faith, I wanted to hear both sides. I began to think, I can't really identify with evangelicalism. And I then broadened out my really omnivorous reading into various other types of Christianity and other religions. Became a big fan of Bultmann and Tillich, who I had thought were just awful, but I found them quite cogent. I began to take a second look at the apologists I had read and I had such high regard for, and I thought, gee, why did they never mention this? Why did they not bring this into consideration? And I eventually decided I can't identify with this anymore. And I went through, I think, a fairly brief reaction period where I felt like I'd been misled and so forth, and was pretty steamed about it. But I've eventually realized I can't do this. I must integrate my past and my present and value the good things my life of faith did for me. And ever since then, I've been a religion-loving non-theist. I guess I kind of view myself as the loyal opposition. I love religion. I have a book coming out anytime now called Houses of the Holy, a higher critical guide to world religions. And I edit a journal, the Journal of Higher Criticism, and with innovative articles about critical theories about the Bible and the Quran, the Book of Mormon, anything considered a scripture. And I love religious people. I do not try to get people to abandon their faith. That's none of my business what anybody believes. I just feel like I have a kind of Socratic mission because, as I like to paraphrase, the unexamined faith is not worth believing, which I happen to know William believes too, and because he does a lot of examining of it. And so I like to be in dialogue with religion, and rather than just trying to stamp it out, I can't really claim to be a part of any faith, but I'm very reluctant these days to identify with organized atheism either, because there's this nasty, scorched earth hatred that comes out. Not every atheist is like that, but I really can't stand that. And I worked for the Council for Secular Humanism for a few years, and I just found that I'm nowhere really, and or like Tillich said, on the boundary, and I like it better that way, to just be open, and that's kind of where I'm at, wherever that is.
Thank you for that, Bob. Thank you for that, Dr. Price. So, Deacon, my friend, tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Thanks again for bringing me on, William. It's nice to meet you all. I am a subdeacon, like William said, in the Syriac Orthodox Church. I have a master's degree from San Diego State University in history and another master's from Agora University in theology, theological studies. I'm honored and humbled to have this conversation with you.
Father, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, my friend?
Sure. Thank you again, William, for inviting me back. Gentlemen, again, a pleasure to meet you all this evening. I am an Orthodox priest for 31 years. I am married with 2 kids, originally from California. I have a story that I was listening intently as John and Robert were talking, and I thought to myself, there's a lot of similarities there. I was born into a cradle Orthodox family, you might say. And in my high school years and my first 2 years of college at UCLA, I got involved in a Reformed Calvinist Presbyterian church. I was in Campus Crusade for Christ. I was in InterVarsity Fellowship briefly, and loved those experiences. But I found that there was a question they could not answer that I brought up rather innocently, not to challenge any of the youth pastors or anything like that. But I remember at a Bible study one day, I asked the question, what happened to the church? The apostles died. And the answer they threw back at me that I received numerous times was, well, it just fell apart. And I thought to myself, well, that's not what you've been telling us for years about how Jesus said, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it and things like that. So I started to read as well, except I stayed away from Bultmann and Tillich and all these other guys because I knew that would be trouble. And I tried to find, because I remember St. Paul saying to Timothy, Timothy, what I've taught you, teach to others so that they can teach others. And I thought, well, who are those others? And in doing some reading, I discovered a book called The Apostolic Fathers, which represents, if not that third generation that Paul was talking to Timothy about, certainly represents that sub-apostolic era. So these were the men in some cases that were actually mentioned in Scripture, like Clement. And it occurred to me that if the apostles taught them anything, they would be reflecting that in their own teachings. And so I began to read early church history. When I asked a lot of Protestant pastors about early church history, they kind of responded to me with a blank stare and didn't know what I was talking about. Well, it began with Luther. No, it didn't begin with Luther. So I knew I was on to something because they were not talking about what I was reading. But through that study, I came back to the Orthodox faith, convinced it was the right path for me, and since then convinced it's the right path for everybody. And I am right now the co-host, co-creator of a YouTube podcast called The Transfigured Life, in which we explore a lot of the teachings of the Orthodox faith. And right now I'm just very, very interested in bringing the knowledge of that faith to a public that is yearning and hungry and thirsty for solid teaching, solid truth.
Thank you very much for that, Father. That was fantastic. So let me get the ball rolling. We'll go. Let me go with John first, because I know John has done a lot of work on this. Indeed, I've debated him on the topic. And then maybe we can get interaction from either Father or Subdeacon. John, you do not believe that the virgin birth or the incarnation is reasonable. Can you perhaps give your reasons as to why you do not believe it to be a reasonable thing that anybody should believe?
Yeah, Wayne, by the way, I want to congratulate you on your books and the recommendations
Thank you, my friend.
have received, and the people who have written for you and the people who come on your podcast. It's awesome. I think that's just something that needs to be noticed here, because that's just awesome. Okay.
Thank you, my friend.
It's too bad you're wrong, but I spent a lot of time on something that's wrong. My main contention is that there's no evidence. No evidence. No relevant evidence for the virgin birth of Jesus. No relevant evidence. There's evidence. There's testimony. There's testimony. Okay. We hear about it from first we hear about it from Matthew and then Luke, and there's no unequivocal statement that Paul understands that that Jesus was born of a virgin. No unequivocal text. So what you have there is the first Mark bypassed it, and then you jump to Matthew. Now, Matthew is really interesting because in chapter 1, and all of you know this, is that Joseph was convinced that Mary was telling him the truth, that the baby inside her was placed there by God. And he was convinced, not because she said so. He was convinced because he had a dream. And in Matthew 1, it says he fell asleep. And then next it says he had a dream. And next it said he awoke. and then he believed Mary's story. So, that really speaks directly to the gospel itself, because if that goes in the gospel, then what else goes in the gospel that is, well, unbecoming a rational adult? Like, for instance, you wouldn't be convinced of a dream of almost anything else, in the modern world, because we know something about dreams. So it's included there, and I think that that's not evidence. I don't think Mary's evidence. I wonder even how you would go about investigating Mary's claim. The proto-evangelical James did so, and all of a sudden Salome decided to check out her hymen, apparently. But that too is not anything that is considered evidence, because it might be evidence for her, just like doubting Thomas might have existed, and he might have been convinced that Jesus arose. That might have happened, but that's not enough for us today, because we can't cross-examine them to see, if they're telling the truth, or we can date the Gospel of James, but we have no evidence, no relevant. That's not relevant evidence. Now, relevant evidence would be something we can talk about later. But first, let me talk about. Let me challenge people to produce the relevant evidence that Mary gave birth to God's Son. I throw that out as a challenge.
Father, would you like to pick up that challenge and respond?
Well, John, let me first correct you. I think you said that Joseph believed Mary's story. It wasn't really Joseph believing Mary's story, and an angel appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "No, this baby that's being conceived is of God. Take her as your wife." But I want to just before I directly try, which is going to be difficult, I'll admit, try to address what John said. Let me appeal to the idea of eyewitness testimony. Now, the only extant version we have of the nativity story, the more detailed one, is actually in Luke, not in Matthew. And we know that Luke was a traveling companion of St. Paul. We know that St. Paul spent 3 years in Ephesus. We also know that the Apostle John spent a long time in Ephesus and had under his care the Virgin Mary. Now, we can extrapolate fact from fact and say it's entirely possible that while Paul and Luke were in Ephesus, they met Mary. And as might be natural for someone meeting the mother of their Lord, saying to her, "What was it like when Jesus was a boy? What was it like when he was an infant? How was he born? Things like this." So it's often believed that the infancy narrative, the infancy narrative that we have in Luke, is something that he wrote down from herself, that he asked her how it all took place, and she said, and he wrote down, and this is what we have in Luke. Now, John mentioned relevant evidence. I think we have to define what that is, of course. But in that sense, if we believe that, what I just said, then we have the recording of an eyewitness testimony, someone that said to Mary, "How was he born?" She said, "This is how he was born." He wrote it down, and that's what we have in Luke. Now, obviously, that takes a certain amount of faith to believe and to accept. Beyond that, when John is asking for relevant evidence, I'd like to hear his definition of what relevant evidence is, so that we can then talk about that and move it forward.
Okay, I'll answer that. I've been asked that a lot, and I want to state first and forthrightly, before I go on, what does not count as objective evidence. Second, third, fourth-hand hearsay testimonial evidence doesn't count, and that's what you described. I mean, just because someone tells somebody, we are to believe a report that Mary may have told Paul this. That's one removed from what Mary said first. What else doesn't count is circumstantial evidence, anecdotal evidence, as reported in documents that are centuries later than the supposed events, which were copied by scribes and theologians who had no qualms about including forgeries. We also know that subjective feelings or experiences or inner voices don't count as objective evidence when it comes to biblical miracle claims, nor someone who tells others his writings are inspired, nor alleged divine communication through dreams or visions, nor can the special pleading of subjective psychic divine communication from the supposed Holy Spirit, as William Lane Craig asserts. Let's just talk about that, because I claim that's all you have.
Okay, you mentioned manuscripts written centuries later. Luke was written.
That was an exaggeration, probably like a little bit of an exaggeration, but that
was quite an exaggeration, John. And to lump one document that was written within just several decades after the death of Christ himself to manuscripts that are hundreds of years old is quite a mingling of fact and fiction. We're not talking about something that is hundreds of years old. We're talking about a document that purports to be the eyewitness testimony. And remember, Luke at the beginning of his gospel and at the beginning of Acts talks about how he took pains to speak to people and to write down accurately what had been known about Jesus Christ in his lifetime. So we're not talking about something that is centuries removed from the time in which these things took place, but we're talking about something that's only decades removed, and someone who was himself an eyewitness, talking with and writing down the testimony of an eyewitness to those events, Mary herself.
Now, I'd like to hear from Dr. Price on the dating of these documents in just a second. But I want to say to hitchhike on what you said about Luke. Since he was clearly trying to write things that actually occurred, and since Matthew was prior to Luke, then he leaves out the Bethlehem star, and it seems like to me that can only mean that he didn't think the Bethlehem star was either important enough to include or happen. So I defer to Dr. Price at this point.
Yeah, let me move over to you, Dr. Price. Maybe let me get the ball rolling with you. Do you have an issue with the virgin birth, with the incarnation? Is it because of the dating of manuscripts? Do you think the manuscripts are just too late to be reliable? What are your thoughts on that? Maybe you can lay that out, and maybe either Subdeacon or Father can engage with that.
Well, I take, I guess a minority view, though, for what it's worth, more and more people, scholars are accepting it. That doesn't mean anything, of the dating of all the Gospels as products of the mid-2nd century, like the Tübingen scholars did. I could go into a bunch of genre parallels to contemporary novels of the period that sound eerily like certain sections of the Gospels. And also the kinship they seem to bear to the apocryphal Acts and various other items that it would take a long time to go into. But no matter what their age, it's not impossible that you could have surviving eyewitness testimony even for so long a period. But that doesn't mean that that's probably what happened. Often you have this argument, well, we can envision a set of events according to which eyewitness testimony to Jesus survived for a long time. But like the attempt to recruit Gerhardsen and what the heck's the other guy's name? These two Swedish scholars that tried to understand oral tradition as if we knew that was the basis of the Gospels, which we don't. They tried to understand that in terms of later rabbinic models of transmission of the oral Torah. And so if the disciples of Jesus were following the same sort of rabbinic memorization approach, well, then it could be that it was faithfully transmitted. Well, that's just the point at issue. We don't know that. It's possible. Or the idea that evangelical apologists use, that the disciples wouldn't have allowed secondary sayings and inauthentic stories to be circulated. They'd have kept a good eye on this and made sure to squelch everything that was apocryphal. How
I think Bob might have frozen up there. There we go. He's back.
Debunking urban legend. We don't know that. We don't even know anything about the apostles. By far, most of them, they're just names on a list, and they don't always agree with each other. The lists. It seems to me that the mere possibility doesn't count as evidence that it happened. In fact, the whole approach seems to me to be circular, taking for granted a lot of things that are simply the readings most consistent with a prior belief in these miraculous events having occurred. One Catholic scholar whom I agree with on this was the late great Raymond Brown, in an interesting little book called The Virginal Conception and Bodily Resurrection of Jesus. He said, as a historian, I do think the evidence is convincing that Jesus rose from the dead. As to the virgin birth, no. He said, as a Roman Catholic, I'm called upon to believe it, so I do as a matter of faith. But I admit, if you're just starting from ground zero, there's not sufficient evidence to believe in it. But he realized there's two different epistemologies going on here. He's wearing two hats, and he's loyal to a creed that stipulates that certain things must have happened, like the assumption of Mary into heaven. He thought there was even less or no evidence for that, but he was loyal to the Catholic creed and said, all right, I'm signing on to it because of an epistemology about the teaching of the true church, etc. That's not historical methodology. And I don't approach it with prior warrants like that. I have to say, let me just look at what sources we have, and the outlook does not look good for a number of reasons, to me anyway. The fact that Matthew and Luke both have nativity stories, unlike Mark and John, and that Matthew and Luke differ on almost every point. The not the least strange thing about it is they both include genealogies of Jesus, which seem to be utterly beside the point if their own assertion of a virginal conception is true. It looks to me like that, like most of the Bible, these Gospels are patchworks enshrining different opinions from different quarters of the church. And I just don't think it looks like we're dealing with historical data any more than we are in the infancy gospel of Thomas or the infancy gospel of Matthew or anything like that. Plus, again, Matthew and Luke seem to be, they're remarkably similar to current documentations. Like Luke's infancy narrative bears an amazing resemblance to Pseudo-Philo's Biblical Antiquities version of the Nativity of Moses, whereas Matthew's is astonishingly similar to Josephus's rewrite of the Nativity of Moses. Like, why is this? It seems to me they're just using literary sources, and I don't think the virgin birth would be a bad idea that ought to be combated or exploded. It just seems to me it's if you're asking what sort of documentation is this, well, it's like hagiography and so forth. It's faith concretized into stories that are not far removed from fairy tales. And again, I am not criticizing them. I love these stories. They're brilliant and they have something to say, but I don't think they're, it's more like they're parables. That's not a parable, but in the same way that it's fiction, but edifying and important. And so it just seems to me that we don't have adequate evidence for such a thing. And finally, let me say, I don't rule it out because, well, we know miracles don't happen. I don't know any such thing. How the heck would I know? And I don't, have the universe mapped out. I don't know what can and can't happen. If somebody has a spontaneous remission of cancer and the doctors can't explain it, was it God? I can't say it wasn't. I don't know what's going on in the universe at large. And so I can't say, well, virgin birth, nonsense. No, that's not the approach I take. I just don't see convincing evidence of such a thing.
Subdeacon, your particular thoughts on the comments that Dr. Price has made?
If it's okay, I would like to respond to Mr. Loftus.
Definitely. Go ahead.
You asked the question about, you said, what is the evidence that Mary gave birth to the Son of God? So it seems like the question is not so much for you, at least, of Mary giving birth to Jesus of Nazareth, but that he's the Son of God is the issue. So there's, I guess, two questions on the table now that we need to address, and they go together, of the virgin birth and who he was who was born of Mary. I think your question invites both answers. But when you're asking what is the evidence, I'm asking you, what is the evidence that you would accept? Father Jonathan already asked you, but you just went on with another list of what is not evidence. You didn't answer the question of what evidence would be. For me, when I see people like you guys mentioned Luke earlier, Luke was a journalist, a physician. He was a Hellen. He was a Hellenic Jew, maybe, or he for sure was Greek somehow. Either he was a Hellenic Jew or just a Greek. But it was counterintuitive for him to believe in this. He converted, and we know the story of Saul of Tarsus also. Another counterintuitive story. Why would he change his whole life? So then you have these early figures, not to mention everyone who was the eyewitnesses. Dr. Price mentions the evidence for the resurrection. So if the one who was born from Mary is proven to be the Son of God, which I think there's a lot of evidence for that, then automatically the virgin birth would be true. However, again, I want to ask you, what evidence would you accept for the virgin birth?
Well, I think that the virgin birth is key, which leads to say that child being the Son of God. I'm not sure we can talk about the Trinity or the relationship between the Son and the Father. That's not the point necessarily, but it does lead into that. If someone were to tell you that so and so had a virgin birth baby, you would be just like me, skeptical, and you would like to see the baby, but you'd like to check the hymen. You'd like to see if she had a chastity belt on before she gave birth. You would like to see a Maury Povich show where someone shows Maury shows that the alleged father is not the baby's daddy. You don't have any of that. We can't even cross-examine Mary or Joseph or anybody else there because they're dead now, in my opinion. Of course it is. It's obvious. So I can't question them. I can't ask them. And the first line of reasoning would be maybe they're telling a lie, or maybe one of them is, or maybe both of them is, and that would be the natural response if someone had told you that. But because it's in a religious book and it's an ancient book, and you're in a religious order, you have a tendency to believe that when you wouldn't believe it anywhere else, because seeing is believing in that case. A DNA test show that the baby is, say, not of Mary or not of Joseph, or if it is of Mary, then where's the human semen coming from? Because you can't even have a human baby without a human semen. So and if God had created that, then all of a sudden that's no longer a human. That would be a baby that's no longer human, and supposedly, according to the creeds, he'd have to be God man. So not only is there logical inconsistencies with who that being is, the genealogies, as Bob mentioned earlier, None of that makes really a lot of sense either. So not enough evidence, and not much sense. So respond to that if you would, please.
So essentially, and please correct me if I'm misunderstanding you, what you're saying is in 2024, there's nothing that we can look at a first century scenario according to what they had available to them at that time and take that as reliable evidence. For example, even if there is documentation of, say, her hymen being checked or whatever it is, that the documentation would then be, well, how accurate is it? So there's nothing really for in 2024 that would be, as for you you live right now, that you could have from the first century to then verify that it was.
Yes, and I need to stress something here because I know where you're going with this. You'll say, well, they didn't have these sorts of technologies. Well, I maintain if God were God and could foresee a modern scientific age, then and if he sent Jesus to die on the cross somehow for our sins, then he could have waited 20 centuries later to send his son, and then we would have DNA evidence from if somebody had saved Jesus's foreskin, for instance, and matched it with the resurrected body, and say, well, Jesus is. If we could interrogate Jesus and ask him what only Jesus would know, and if he'd give us some kind of mysteries that only God would know, that would just blow our minds away, that would be the kind of thing we'd look for. We could have cell phone footage of the birth. We could have cell phone footage of his resurrection, and his life and his ministry, and him flying up into heaven. And see, don't put that beyond God, because if God could send Jesus to die on the cross on our sins, what century doesn't matter that he did so. He could have waited 20 centuries and died for the sins of the past 20 centuries of human beings, just like he died in the first century and died for the sins of all the previous centuries of people who needed their sins died or atoned for. So I see nothing there that God couldn't have done. And I think theologians lack an imagination of what God could actually have done because their imaginations are stunted because of their faith.
So we agree that God can do anything. So your issue is the timing, that the story happens in a time where this is unverifiable for you. Now
The evidence, just the evidence, yeah.
I would say, obviously from a faith perspective, I would say where Jesus says to Thomas, he says, "You believed because you saw. Blessed are those who who believe without seeing." Now, after Christianity continues for 2,000 years in this same faith, the virginity of Mary attested to from the first century, and continues on, never doubted really in proto-Orthodox, as it's called, and then continuing to Orthodoxy. It's never doubted. Even when Islam starts and continues until this day, all the Muslims also believe in the virginity of Mary. In the Eastern world, this is not a matter of, there's no doubt here, and it seems like God, like you said, God, he could have done it now, etc. But perhaps God has a reason, and his will doesn't always it doesn't. So if I tell a lie to you right now, we don't believe that's God's will. This is why I tell him, may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Now, this questioning, or this line of questioning, I believe it stems from the Enlightenment era, and probably you could make an argument from the Protestant Reformation, etc. Now, and then it keeps going, and it's very Western in origin. So this is not the one who seeks necessarily absolute truth. It's more like, if I want to doubt, what can I hold on to doubt?
I never wanted to doubt, by the way.
Let me allow Father. You want to hop in there, respond to either John or Dr. Price, whatever you want to do, my friend.
Well, a couple of observations. I want to go back to something Dr. Price said a little while ago, bringing up the names of various different contemporary theologians. He mentioned Tübingen, and a lot of the Tübingen school for our viewers is in Germany. That's where textual criticism came from, essentially, in the 19th century, beginning in the 19th century, and others, including Robert Brown, whose books I've read, and things like that. It's interesting that you have a number of contemporary, call them theologians, historians, whatever they are, questioning these ancient teachings, ancient texts, things like that. But if we go back to, I don't know, the 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century, what people back then thought, what learned theologians and academicians and historians and so forth back then thought about the virgin birth would reveal a widespread admission to its historicity. For example, and this is just for example, beginning with Tertullian and going on through the beginning of the 5th century, and I'm going to get his name wrong, forgive me, I want to say Osorius, a church official named Osorius, beginning with Tertullian, about 150, Osorius, maybe 410, something like that. There were many people in the Roman Empire back then who said, are you doubting that this took place? Are you doubting that this event is real? Go to the Roman archives. Guess what? That census that was taken under Quirinius during the reign of Augustus, it's there. It's in the Roman archive. You can go today to, in their years, in their centuries, you can go today to Rome and you can see it. It's there. And Joseph's name was in that census when he went to Bethlehem to be enrolled. So there is historicity to the event. There's no doubt that people back then, having access to documents we don't have today, having access to manuscripts that may not have survived to today, we know that there were manuscripts back then of the scriptures because the church fathers through the centuries, up until the time of the 4th century when they began to be codified, such as Sinaiticus and some of the other ones, we know that these existed on papyrus because there's like 5,000 papyri fragments in which the words of scripture have been preserved. There's very few codexes or complete manuscripts, and some people say, well, that's proof. That's not proof of anything, because remember, in those first 300 years of the history of the church, the Roman Empire, led by pagan Roman emperors, would go into places and raid churches and take manuscripts and burn them and destroy them along with chalices and other things. So we don't have a lot that's left from that era because of things like that. Many of these raids, for example, have been documented. We know about them. So the idea that, well, we have nothing extant from that period that tells us exactly how real or how historical these events were, that there's a reason for that. But among the people who lived during that era and wrote what they knew and so forth, there is an incredible documentation of witnesses, of people who were taught and who were told things by the apostles, who wrote things down, what they said, and things like that. And we have their writings, and we know what they thought and what they were told and so forth about events like the ever virginity of Mary and the incarnation of Jesus Christ, such that St. Athanasius of Alexandria wrote a very, very short but famous document called On the Incarnation, which was one of the seminal works that explained the need for the Son of God to become incarnate in a virgin selected by God himself. No capriciousness there. He did it. He had a reason for picking Mary. And why the Son of God had to come into the world incarnate as a man, how that happened, what its effect was on humanity, and things like that. So this is not something that we guessed about for 2,000 years. And finally, in the 20th and 21st century, enlightened German theologians from Tübingen explained everything to us. That's not how it's worked. See, at least that's not how it's worked in the Orthodox Church for 2,000 years. Our people, our theologians, our bishops, and so forth, were closest to these events more than anybody else, with all due respect to William and the Roman Catholic Church, certainly closer to these events than people in the West were. And there's a preservation of this tradition in the Orthodox Church that it was never questioned by anybody in the ancient church. Nobody ever brought up objections about documents or anything like that. It just was very clearly taught and believed, to the point where very learned theologians like Martin Luther, John Calvin, Ulrich Zwingli, and many others also believed in and taught the virgin birth themselves, even for a long time after they broke away from Roman Catholicism. It was that logical. It was that true. The scriptures bore witness to it.
Dr. Price, I'd love to get your thoughts. Go ahead.
Tertullian thought that there must be Roman records of this, such as the census of Quirinius and all that. But if you look at the New Testament accounts, it shows he was wrong, because no one ever conducted a census where you had to show up many, many miles from where you lived, where they would come to pick up your taxes, but rather you had to go to where your remote ancestors had lived 1,000 years before. He has to go to the city of David because he's descended from him. That's madness. He's just trying an expedient to explain how Jesus happened to be born in Bethlehem, though his parents are said to live in Nazareth in Luke. It's just the other way around in Matthew. But no census was conducted that would have shown that they had gone to visit Joseph. How would they even have known he had gone to Bethlehem? This doesn't answer any of the questions that arise from looking like they couldn't have taken a Roman taxation census in Matthew's chronology because Judea, Samaria, etc., weren't part of the Roman Empire. They were client states. But Herod was a king. Didn't tax
Dr. Price,
them
of course, they were part of the Roman
afterward.
state. They had garrisons there. They collected taxes there.
Not
Of course,
during
they were
that
part of the Roman
time.
Empire.
Now, Judas of Galilee led a revolt because of the novelty of Roman taxation of Jews in 6 AD, whereas Herod died in 4 BC, and this is supposed to have taken place before he died. Well, it wasn't a Roman province then. They couldn't have taken taxes there, and when they did, it was 10 years later, it was such an outrage that Judas of Galilee led the big rebellion. So Tertullian apparently didn't know this. I mean, in fact, Quirinius wasn't even in charge of the Roman province of Syria in Luke's day. Tertullian himself happens to mention that there were two guys, Severus Septimus, I think it was, and the other, the guy that what's his name, Quintilius Varus. So it's just he didn't know what he was. Tertullian wasn't a historian, and when he gets into polemics against people he thinks are heretics, he's just a mudslinging. It just seems to me that there is no reason to accept what these guys say. They were in no position. It was too late already. So I place nothing. It's like Papias. Papias, oh, here's a guy from the mid-2nd century who knew the apostles and all that. Oh, yeah, and we're going to believe the guy that said Judas swelled up to the size of a parade balloon and then exploded like Mr. Creosote in Monty Python's Meaning of Life. That's how we're to believe that? Come on. These guys didn't know anything anyway. And that begins to make me wonder if there was anything to know. I'm not even persuaded anymore that Jesus existed as a historical figure, though I'm willing to take that for granted since we're zeroing in on the virgin birth. But I just don't think any of that dead, like Martin Luther is right about one thing, the dead hand of tradition that he said tradition. Yeah, sounds good. There must have been apostolic tradition that didn't happen to get recorded in the apostolic writings of the New Testament. But there's so much other stuff that couldn't have come from them. We can't tell, so we just have to let it go. Well, that's all the more the case with the pseudo history of the early church.
Let me briefly make a comment about that to my friend Bob. And Bob knows very well that I do a lot of work in the early fathers. I don't think you're being very fair with Papias there. Now, I do understand. I know Bob, and Bob very famously loves it when I push back against him. He's called me a spin doctor many times. I'm going to be a spin doctor again in his mind. But I don't think that Bob is being fair, because Papias is clearly utilizing symbolic language. He is very clearly utilizing symbolic language. Come on, Bob. He's utilizing symbolic language in order to emphasize the horrific death of Judas. He's using symbolic language. And Bob,
how can you live with yourself saying
I live with myself very well, because at the end of the day, I know the way that he was emphasizing events. He's utilizing them in a very symbolic manner. And I live with myself very well, Bob, because I don't go to gospels like the infancy gospel of Thomas and then try to say that these are even remotely similar to the other gospels. No, Bob, they're, number one, Bob, they're written later. You know that. Be honest with the audience. They're written later. Here are the other. Yeah, but Papias is not in the canonical text. And earlier you compared canonical writings to these pseudonymous documents that the early church never accepted. So, Bob,
we don't know who wrote any of the canonical documents.
Of course we do. Of course we do.
Manuscripts didn't have any authorial names.
You are incorrect,
and even
there,
if
Bob.
they did, there were thousands of guys named Mark.
You are not correct. You're not correct. I know John's made that argument before. No, you're not. John has made this argument
William
before,
and Dr. Price, if I may, please.
Yes,
I want to. If you're gonna, I mentioned a number of people who cited the census, and you focused on Tertullian. Let me just mention a couple of things. This is Justin Martyr, who lived in the 2nd century. Now, there's a village in the land of the Jews, 35 stadia from Jerusalem, in which Jesus Christ was born, as you can ascertain also from the registers of the taxing made under Cyrenius, your first procurator in Judea. Now, hold on a second. Justin Martyr lived in Rome. He may very well have seen that register. I mentioned Tertullian. Here's Cyril of Jerusalem, who lived in the 4th century. St. Cyril of Jerusalem also asks Pope Julius I to assign the true date of Christ's birth, quote, from census documents brought by Titus to Rome. And as a result of that, Julius assigned December 25th.
It wasn't a Roman province yet.
You keep insisting that. I don't know that there's a historian on the face of this earth who would agree with you. No, everybody understands Judea was a Roman process.
So let me, John, let me engage with John very briefly. I want to go engage with John because this is an argument John has made as well before. And I want to call it out. The idea that early manuscripts were all of them anonymous. No, they weren't. If you want to talk about the earliest fragments, maybe we can go there. But the early codices, the ones that we're talking about that have the Gospels either complete or the majority of them, they do have the Gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Come on, Bob, you know better.
Late. They're codices. No. We have some fragments that may come from something.
Okay, but notice the bait and switch there, Bob. As you tell the audience there that they're anonymous, now you say, "Oh, well, it doesn't matter because they're too late." Which one is it? We've got them, but they're too late. I don't think that they're
not
too late,
incompatible. Bob. I'm saying you don't know that the originals actually had that. It's like Warfield used to say, too bad we don't have the originals to check out. And Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, Alexandrinus, they're hundreds of years after the writing of these documents.
But here's the one thing that you need to realize as well, Bob and Johnny, you both know it. You're in a panel tonight with apostolic Christians, not with Protestants. We don't care about Warfield. Neither of us here care about him. We've got the early church fathers about Warfield. We care about the early church fathers.
Here's a guy that admitted we don't have the originals.
An apostolic Christian, we're not in the dilemma that Protestants are in. We have the early church fathers that we can utilize, and the early church fathers are unanimous on the authorship of the Gospels. We're not in the dilemma that Protestants are in,
That
Bob. So
proves
you know that.
nothing. They're way too late.
No, the early fathers are not too late. Apostolic era.
Oh, come
how
on.
can you tell me that's too late? Come on, Bob. John, you're
Well,
going to say
look at
something.
the dates when they lived.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, now you're in a position, William, pardon me, just as the inerrantists in the Protestant tradition are. They believe their Bible no matter what. You believe the consensus of the theologians of the first 3-4 centuries. I mean, I know they had their debates, and you know about the debates, but they arrived at certain creeds. The Nicene Creed was not exactly accepted initially. It took a few more wars for that to be embraced. But
you're not correct again, John. I know, and I know the book that you're referring to. Look, John, I go to firsthand scholarship. You're incorrect. I know that book you're referring to, the Wars, the Christian Wars, or whatever, that it says that, look, the Nicene Creed may not have been accepted by the Arian heretics. In the church, the Orthodox accepted the Nicene Creed. That was very clear. If you want to talk about semi-Arians or other heretics, that's a whole other story. The Orthodox accepted it from the very beginning. And here's another thing, John, and Bob knows this. Well before Nicaea, you've got council gatherings, for instance, in Antioch, where they're gathering and they're condemning people like Paul of Samosata, who are denying the divinity of Christ. This was believed well before Nicaea, John.
Oh, I don't doubt
so there
that.
is uniformity. Yeah, you know that. You know. So here's the thing. What I think is important to point out, there is uniformity early on in the early church. What you do realize, Bob, and you claimed earlier, you brought up, and I mean, for the life of me, I don't understand why you would say that the Gospel of St. Matthew is similar to Josephus. Come on, Bob. How many years later was Josephus written? I don't know a single
wasn't written
scholar.
later. Matthew is probably a 2nd century work.
Bob, what scholar on the planet would take that position? You know that's massively
there are
minority.
plenty now. Steve
there's
Mason,
not. No,
big
there are not.
authority on Josephus in the New Testament. This is, but you can't take a nose count. You can't just vote and poll the delegation. It doesn't matter. I mean, if you want to say the consensus of scholars, well, but consensus of scholars to put Jesus to death, were they right?
No. I don't care about the consensus. Let's look in early church history. Nobody's ever taken this position, and now in the modern day era,
the consensus, the appeal.
No. Well, look, it's 2024. Then, so what? You're going to alter what you believe in 2025 because you got a few guys that know better than the
William.
early church?
Can I jump in here for a moment,
Father? Please do, Father. Please do.
William, Dr. Price. Let me ask you a question. Who is Plato's teacher?
Socrates.
Socrates, right. Did Socrates write anything that's been left to us to read?
No, and therefore there's debate over what he actually said. The early, the middle, the later dialogues of Plato, Xenophanes, there's similar debate.
Socrates, nevertheless, is quoted by many people. Now, how do we know if Socrates himself did not leave behind anything? How do we know what he wrote? Because other people wrote down stuff that they know he said. That was recorded by Plato,
say what he said, but Plato may have simply been using him in the middle and later dialogues as a mouthpiece for his extrapolations.
And he very much his teacher the honor of writing down what he said so that future generations would know what his master and teacher actually said.
Well, that fits the apologetic statement, but that's position. But I don't think there's any reason to believe that. There's such a difference in development between the early, middle, and later dialogues that almost everybody seems. I mean, I don't know. There must be some that don't, but think that he may have started out actually taking notes and recording stuff. But by the time you get to the later ones, like the Republic, he's just using Socrates as a mouthpiece, just as the author of the Gospel of John is certainly doing with Jesus.
Well, that would be nonsense. But again,
come on, this is pointless.
It is rather pointless. But when we talk about the manuscript evidence, as William started to talk about, the manuscript evidence, as I said, over 5,000 papyri pieces that are available for analysis and study match the sections of extant manuscripts to show that what those pieces detailed and said are reflected in the extant manuscripts that we have with us, whether Alexandria or...
I think that there is a great accuracy in the transmission. Bart Ehrman.
That's what you said earlier. No, but that's not what you said earlier. You said there was not an accurate transmission, that these things...
No, I did not say that.
The point we're trying to make is that if we want to talk about manuscript integrity, we could certainly have a whole episode about that, and that would be rather fascinating. But the fact of the matter is, the gospel is a proclamation. It's not something the church wrote down right away, because that's not how it was spread. It was spread through public teaching, public proclamation, that was followed up by private teaching. So you had kerygma, the public proclamation, you had dogma, the private teaching and private proclamation. And this was how the church taught and spread. This is how St. Paul did business. I mean, he wrote letters to churches, but there was no extant corpus of his writings, even in his own lifetime, no matter, Peter refers to it, but we don't know how many pieces were in there. We know he wrote a third letter to the Corinthians. That did not survive. We know he wrote a letter to the Laodiceans. That did not survive. But God in his providence somehow has left us a corpus of writings by him, as well as by the evangelists and so forth, Peter and James and so forth, so that we have a written witness to what that public proclamation was at the beginning of the gospel, right after, from Pentecost on. And of course, St. Paul reminds the Thessalonians to hold fast to the traditions which I have taught you, whether by letter or by word of mouth. So there were written instructions. There were also oral instructions. St. Paul says the same thing essentially to Timothy. What I have taught you, Timothy, teach to others. So the idea that we would have a manuscript evidence that would have everything in detail written down and documented.
I'm not saying they would. That's unrealistic. You're right.
That's not how the gospel was spread.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that was it. Nobody ever said anything that wasn't in those documents, but you're operating on a completely pre-critical view of authorship, date, and accuracy, which is just the point at issue here. I mean, if you're arguing from the presuppositions of Orthodox traditional theology, yeah, it's going to come out in a particular way. It's all circular. I just can't take it seriously. And in fact, it's the defense of it that makes me so sure it's wrong. I can't believe you offer some of these arguments.
Now,
I can offer them and I can actually back them up, I think. But I think that the heart of what we're talking about here goes back to something John said a little bit earlier about how if Jesus had waited and come later and we could have filmed it and documented it. John, I have a feeling if that had happened, you still would not believe, because this is not a matter of evidence. It's a matter of faith. And there's an impossibility here. There's a gap where there just is no ability for either of you to trust that God is right. And that God
we're historians. You can't do that. I mean, it's like, do I believe that Washington was the first president? And does that make it true? I don't have to.
Father, you can't attribute to me ignorance. I might be wrong.
I didn't say ignorance, John. I did not say ignorance.
I might be wrong. Okay.
I said trust. There's a difference.
That I'm ignorant about these sorts of things is what you're actually You're claiming that. You can't claim that
I'm not claiming it. It's what I said.
Well, I can't trust in God because I don't believe God exists, and I have all kinds of studies, 3 master's degrees, PhD work, a lot of research into these sorts of things. I might be wrong. That's what I want to say. I might be wrong, but you cannot claim that I'm ignorant and that I'm doing this or that I think the way I do because I'm in rebellion against God, or don't trust God, or don't want to believe in Him, no more than you don't trust Allah and don't want to believe in Him and want to rebel against Him, or the Mormon God, or the Jehovah's Witness God, because they're all different conceptions of God. So you can't do that. You're only falling back on that position because I think somehow you feel like you're losing the argument.
No,
because
you yourself said if Jesus had waited 2,000 years and come so that we could have proof of everything that took place, we could film the virgin birth. You said these things. We could go back in this and we can watch it. You said
that was
then
one.
maybe it would be easier to believe, but this has
That
nothing
was
to do with proof.
That was one scenario. I've got dozens of scenarios. I'll give you another one. Let's just say that the scientific method never was discovered. We don't have trains, planes, and automobiles. We don't have computer chips. We still live in a primitive society where word of mouth matters, and people tell all kinds of tales about dragons in the water and flying serpents. And let's just say that the world existed. Well, then people would come naturally to believe virgins could produce babies, and God would be pleased because He didn't have to do anything. There's all kinds of scenarios. I write about them all the time. I wrote about one. You're picking on that one. I'll write about this one, and that would means that God would want naivete to believe. And what's wrong with that? God could say, I think that's what's happening. Naivety could reign, and God could get His believers as He wants.
Well, God doesn't want naivete. God wants humility. And there's a big difference between one being stupid and ignorant and one being humble in their approach to the God who is their creator and wanting to get to know that God.
I'd like to get Subdeacon,
Assuming
anything
there is
you'd like
one, of
to
course.
respond to?
Yeah, I think it's a very this conversation is very interesting. Watching the sides go back and forth. I'm from an Eastern community, from the Middle East, and the conversations are very different, and the way everyone thinks is very different. So it's interesting to see how this is going. For me, it's the reliance of people on texts being authoritative is, I think, very it's a little bit strange. It's not something that I'm used to.
The reliance on what? I didn't quite hear the word.
On text.
Oh,
Text.
okay.
Yeah. Text having authority to this level to be able to prove or disprove something, where you have a 2,000-year-old oral tradition stemming from before that. And we can make the argument from Isaiah, etc. I'm sure you guys have heard. And just quickly to mention, I'm not sure how familiar everyone here is with the Syriac tradition or the Aramaic tradition. The Syriac Peshitta, it's called, the Syriac Bible. It's actually a translation from a 1st century or older Hebrew, unlike the Masoretic, which is probably early 2nd millennium or something around that. This is a translation from the 1st century or older Hebrew, including the Deuterocanonicals of the Peshitta. So-called Deuterocanonicals are also translated from Hebrew, not from Greek, and it's a much more natural, easy translation because there's so many cognates. They're related languages, right? Aramaic and Hebrew. So anyway, that word in Isaiah that modern scholars are arguing about over the little young girl or virgin, it's not an issue for us because it's been virgin the whole time. Tulta. It's always been that word. We've had it before this problem, and it's come down to us like that even before. And William can attest to the Greek, but I'm saying this because of how much value you seem to put into text. Still, I'm kind of appeasing or compromising the argument by giving this. But for me, it's irrelevant because there is a truth that has come down from a much more ancient and trustworthy source over so many centuries, and with so many martyrs and so many eyewitnesses and so many accounts that we've received now. And then now all of a sudden we would open our eyes in 2025 and all due respect, there are certain individuals saying to us, oh, that didn't happen or this didn't happen. But we know it happened because we were there. Maybe I personally wasn't there, and neither was my dad or my grandfather, but it came all the way down to me from the beginning, and we paid a lot for this. It cost us a lot. It cost us many martyrs in my tribe and my clan and my heritage. Not just me, all of us come back home. It's very convenient, and it's very luxurious of you to be able to question and to doubt these things.
May I? This is slightly off topic, but you, three of you, are in a good position to answer a question I've had for a long time. Why do the books that Protestants call the Apocrypha, why are they called deuterocanonical in Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Oriental Orthodoxy, etc.? It sounds like, it means the second canon, right? But why are they? It almost implies they're kind of second string, which I think they're not, right?
Right, Doctor. So I just used the term for Western naming convention, so you know what I'm talking about.
Though who doesn't use that? It strikes me as
we don't call it deuterocanonical,
right?
But
neither do we.
So you know what we're talking about. That's why.
We officially. Let me be clear. Officially, the Catholic Church does not use it. But whenever we're dialoguing with Protestants, evangelicals, to let them know which books we're discussing, then we'll either refer to them as deuterocanonical or even apocryphal, even though we know they're not apocryphal. They very often will utilize those terms, but officially, they're just part of the Bible. And I know
that's
Father
the
would
way
agree
I
with
view
that.
It personally,
Subdeacon would, and that's how they are. And as you know very well, you've got John up here that knows, and you as well, Dr. Price. That is one issue that is a big difference between Protestants and apostolic Christians. We have a bigger Bible, books that were later removed by Protestants. You know that well, Bob. You've done a lot of research as an atheist.
Well, yeah, I believe the Palestinian rabbis said they're not to be read in the public lectionary, but there's nothing wrong with them. But still, they weren't canonical, and I believe St. Jerome echoed that later, but all Greek-speaking Christians simply considered the Bible until Martin Luther.
Jerome would later yield to the authority of Pope Innocent in accepting those books. So early on, Jerome had issues with them, not because of the contents of them, so much as because of Hebrew verity. He could not find Hebrew originals. But as we know today, there you go. You know that, Bob. But as we know today, the Dead Sea Scrolls, we did find many Hebrew originals. So that argument, that one in particular, doesn't hold up anymore. I want to pick your brain on this. Both you, John and Bob, and I know, John, you say you're coming out with an article soon. I can't wait to read that. And I've heard you make the argument before that you have an issue with the Isaiah prophecy. You don't think you pretty much think that in the New Testament that it has abused the original meaning, that the original meaning didn't really mean virgin. Maybe we could talk about that a little bit. And I don't know if Bob holds to that as well.
Yeah, it's more than the word change from that uses the word alma. It's more than that. That's been changed to parenthenos.
Parthenos, yeah.
In the Septuagint, which Matthew quoted from. It's more than that, although it is that, because what was a young woman became a virgin because of a word change, and Matthew didn't see the point like he should. But it's more than that. In Isaiah 7:14, what you have is Isaiah talking about Ahaz, King Ahaz, and a child that's going to be born. It doesn't matter whether the child is a virgin born or whether the woman was a virgin, because eventually she had a child. Every woman before they give birth were virgins. See, what it does mean is that how could Jesus be a sign for King Ahaz in that century that he was from? It's just impossible to do. You have to rip it entirely out of its context to have it claimed as a prophecy of Jesus and virgin birth.
Subdeacon or Father, do any of you want to engage?
I'll jump in with a couple thoughts here.
I'm going to grab a drink real quick.
First of all, the Septuagint was the church of the New Testament, and whenever Jesus quoted, or whenever anybody in the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, they're quoting from the Septuagint. There are enough variants that we can see that they're not quoting from the Masoretic, which came much later. They're quoting from the Septuagint. We believe in the Orthodox Church that the Septuagint is an inspired translation. And when you look at things like the prophecy, I want to say Ezekiel, when they come to the gate and the gate was shut and only the prince will enter through the gate and so forth, that there are these passages that have been taken out of the Old Testament as prophesying about the virgin birth. This was also thought, the passage from Isaiah, John, that you're talking about is also thought to be a passage of prophecy. Therefore, when the 70 elders in Alexandria, about 250 years before the Lord was born, translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, they deliberately chose a different word to translate Alma, and they picked Parthena. And that's seen by our church as a prophetic utterance. And so that a virgin would conceive. Well, a virgin can't conceive because she's not a virgin the moment a man enters her. She's not a virgin anymore. So it was seen as a prophetic utterance that a virgin will conceive and bear a son, and his name shall be called, and so forth. So that's part of our understanding of the prophecies of the Old Testament. I'll stop right there.
Well, I mean, if you wanted to interpret Isaiah in its context, you don't find that there. Robert Miller, Jesus Seminar fellow with Robert Price, he says, the imminent birth of the baby is the point. The birth is coming soon, enough to be a sign for King Ahaz that God will protect the throne of David during the current military crisis. The birth of which Isaiah speaks can be a sign for Ahaz only if it is imminent. Isaiah could not possibly have intended to predict the birth of Jesus for the obvious reason that the birth over 700 years in Isaiah's future could not be a sign for Ahaz. I mean, I might have read the wrong quote just right there, but because I already said that. I just don't see how you can get away from that. I just don't. You can say, well, you can say, I have a commentary here that comments on that and says otherwise, like you just did, in this other document. But that doesn't explain what was going on there. It's changing what's going on there.
Well, if I can toss in a comment here, that seems to me to be evidence of the use by New Testament writers of the Pesher technique we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where like the same thing in Hosea 11:1, out of Egypt I've called my son, and Matthew says, aha, you see, there's the Holy Family going into Egypt and coming back out. Matthew was at least trilingual, as you can tell from his various Old Testament quotes. He wasn't so stupid that he thought that Hosea was actually talking about Jesus and expecting his ancient readers to know. It's rather, this became clear once the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, that in their Habakkuk commentary, for instance, they knew good and well what the original point of the text was, but they believed that the Holy Spirit had sort of laid in secondary prophecies that could not be understood as prophecies except in retrospect. And that's one reason, I think, for understandable lack of knowledge of that. Traditionally, scholars have felt like, well, if a New Testament writer says it's a prophecy, I guess we have to believe him. That's oversimple, and they don't need to say such a thing if they understand that Matthew certainly knew what Isaiah was talking about. But Matthew says, aha, I think the wording here suggests something else. And so he wasn't trying to prove to readers that, see, Jesus fulfilled these clairvoyant predictions as if Isaiah was Gene Dixon or something. Rather, it's like with the eye of faith, you can see what was really deeply going on here. And,
now, I do understand that. I had a New Testament class and a master's class. I do understand that. I'm not saying anything different than what you just said, just to be clear. What's going on here is it eliminates any prophecy coming from Isaiah that Jesus was born of a virgin. I mean, Pesher or not, I mean, nobody thinks Pesher is a good way to interpret, say, the Constitution. You see, we've changed to a grammatical, historical interpretation of texts in their context, and so God didn't foresee that. You see, and so I mean, like, let's just say that we get this right now. And it seems like what is gone then, and since Bob is what says right, is a prophecy. The prophecy, there's no prophecy then at all, and that's one or the other is right, and neither one is going to destroy, I think, debunk the idea that there's a prophecy in Isaiah about a virgin birth conceived by Mary.
To briefly comment on that, I'll comment in the name of Subdeacon and Father want to hop in. They definitely can. Number one, I don't know exactly what John said while I went to get a drink on the word Alma or Parthenos, but I've heard what John has said before, and likely he's repeated it and he's wrong. It very clearly does refer to a virgin. Yeah, John's wrong. We've debated it before, and John knows very well how that debate went. I'll remind the audience; they can go watch that. But in all good fun, I'm joking around there. People should definitely check that out, though. Alma very clearly here is referring to a virgin. This cannot refer to the time of Ahaz. There's no possible way at all. There is just no way at all. Furthermore, we don't even have to worry about that particular term there, because John knows very well it isn't the Gospel of St. Matthew that takes it and says it's a virgin, Parthenos. Rather, it is the Jewish Old Testament, the Greek Septuagint. The Gospel of St. Matthew is then taking the language from there, which is fulfilling prophecy. It wasn't the Christians, and Bob is nodding because Bob knows that that's true. It's the Jews that provided that reading of Parthenos for virgin in Isaiah 7. You're going to have to deal with that, John. If they thought that this was fulfilled, where's the indication of that? Emmanuel with us? Very clearly, there's no way that this could have been fulfilled in that particular time. This is very clearly has been viewed as messianic, and it wasn't viewed as having been fulfilled there at that particular time, in the time of Ahaz. Furthermore, when it talks about the Davidic kingdom, it opens it up to a broader context there. I think that that's very clear. Now, of course, Bob and you, John, as well, you can come back and say, well, I still don't believe it. But the fact of the matter is, you look at Isaiah 7 and the immediate context of Ahaz's reign, from the way I read it, and the surrounding context, is a prophecy of a future Messiah. The virgin conceiving and giving birth, it has been viewed as an extraordinary sign from the earliest of times, and it was viewed as messianic very early on. So you can still deny it and say, well, I still don't believe it. But the fact of the matter is, in the New Testament, you didn't have Matthew pulling off any fast hijinks there. Rather, he's quoting from the Greek Jewish Old Testament. It isn't a novelty that the Christians invented. He views this as being fulfilled there. The Christians viewed it as being fulfilled there. So I don't think there's an issue there with the reading. And you made a comment earlier, John. You said that it wouldn't make sense that I guess he would be God. I forgot. I don't want to misrepresent you. But remember what the prophecy means. What is the name of the child? What is the name to be given to the child? Well, he's to be called Emmanuel. Emmanuel does mean God with us. So the very fact that you have that, and then you have Christ presented as Almighty God, he clearly receives his human nature from Mary in Christian theology. That comes from the gospel. So yes, it isn't good. Go ahead, John.
From what I understand, and I could be wrong a lot, but from what I understand, that prophecy was actually fulfilled, if there was to be a prophecy, in Isaiah 8 verses 3, with the birth of his son Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz.
There's nobody in history that has ever believed that child fulfills the prophecy of God with us, literally Emmanuel. I find no historical record of anybody ever believing that fulfills that.
But that's not a prophecy. A prophecy would give it a time and date. Okay.
No, absolutely not. You're incorrect.
No, John, that's wrong.
Go on, Father. Interact with him, Father.
You can express a hope for the future, but that's not a prediction unless you say, give me time, date, specifics, of some kind.
John, prophecy was not about predicting the future. Prophecy was not about predicting the future. Prophecy was about the prophet speaking the word of God to the people, and it actually took a very structured approach. Thus saith the Lord, blah, 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 saith the Lord. That's the way the format of their approach to speaking the word of God to the people of Israel took back then. And it had nothing to do with predicting the future. Now, people think it has to do with predicting the future because they would often say, do this, says the Lord your God, because if you don't do this, this will come upon you. Well, they didn't do this, and this came upon them. So people think they were predicting the future. That's not what they were doing. That's not what prophecy is all about. It's about preaching the word of God and the will of God to a people who are not used to listening to it.
I agree. What point does that have? I mean, are you saying Matthew misinterpreted Isaiah 9:6 and 7:14 then?
No, I'm saying
it's not a prophecy at all.
That Isaiah's prophecy had to do with the coming Messiah. That's what I'm saying.
Well, then it is a prophecy. You just said it's not about prophesying, and we're talking about.
No, I was correcting something you said about predicting the future. That's not what prophecy is about.
Well, in this case, I was referring to this specific case. I know. Thus says the Lord is merely expressing divine communication, usually. Yeah.
Okay. But no, we in the Orthodox Church clearly understand that prophecy in Isaiah was about the coming birth of Emmanuel, God with us, the Son of God come in the flesh, the Incarnation.
I think that when you're for Mr. Loftus, you're saying that the context is what is the sign for him. So I don't know if we agree on what the word sign means and what that is implying when he's saying this is a sign for you. I think that is a question to think about. Is it referring to you're gonna actually see this while you're alive? Is it in English? If I tell you that right now in 2025 in the West, or is sign something that is more something that will be in sacred time for the restoration of the people and the restoration of Adam and the restoration of the people to their inheritance? Is that the sign? So clearly, when it's saying a virgin shall conceive and bear a son and call his name God with us. Does Ahaz's son, is his name God with us? It's not.
It's not right there. Not that specific.
No. And then in Isaiah 9, also, as you know, I'm sure, a child is born, and he will be called Mighty God. So this, and you mentioned something which I've never heard before about a prophecy.
Cool.
A prophecy requires a specific date. It's a very interesting concept to me. The only time I see this, and please, William, Father, if I'm forgetting, remind me. The only time I see where there are specifics to that level is in the book of Daniel. But the prophecies of the book of Daniel by your community, Mr. Loftus, because of how accurate and precise the prophecies are about timing, all the scholarship says, oh, that has to be after the fact. It can't have been written before. So it's like, what are you going to do? We're telling you this thing. You're telling us you give us specifics. When we're giving it to you, you're telling us, oh, you wrote it after the fact.
Well, in Daniel's case, he got everything right until it came to Antiochus Epiphanes' death, and he predicted his death incorrectly and where his body would be laid. I don't have the reference. So, yes, I like specifics because that way I can test them. And in that case, most scholars think that Daniel was written in a way to make it appear as if he was predicting prophecy, when in fact he was just laying out what had already happened. And so
even if that's the case, which it's not, but even if it is, Daniel 9, when he's talking about the Messiah will be cut off and then they will destroy the temple, right? So then after Jesus died, what happened to the temple? What is Daniel talking about? Because according to your dating of Daniel had to have been written when the temple was already destroyed and probably rebuilt. Okay.
I wrote a detailed chapter following Bart Ehrman in my book, The Christian Delusion. It's called "At Best, Jesus Was a Failed Apocalyptic a prophet, and I don't really want to rehearse what I said there right now, if you don't mind, please. I think what we're talking about is the prophecies in Isaiah.
Sure,
And,
sure.
and
but
the details. Here's about the details about this Messiah. You could say, like Christians have said all along, from the beginning, that the Lord's coming, the Lord's coming, the Lord's coming, and Jesus even said, it's recorded him saying that you don't know the time or day or hour. So that's not a specific thing, and the predictions have come and gone and destroyed lives, and as a result, that you could if you want to call that as a prediction. It's an unfulfilled prediction, and there's no way to test it.
Again, I was using Daniel not to change the subject, but to give an illustration of how your logic doesn't follow, Mr. Loftus. Because again, if he's giving a very specific thing, he's saying the Messiah is going to come and he's going to die, and then they're going to destroy the temple, and that's exactly what happened.
I want to refer you to that chapter in my book, if you don't mind, please. It's detailed.
Okay.
I wonder if anybody
okay, go ahead, Bob.
Could shed some light on a passage that has always puzzled me about a sign. When God is telling Moses to go and release his people from Egypt and so forth, he says, "This shall be a sign for you that when you get out of there, you will come and worship God on this mountain," some such thing. That's not the exact wording. What does that mean for it to be a sign? He's telling him to come here to Mount Sinai to worship, but in what sense is it a sign? I'm missing something there. Any ideas on what? This is not a criticism of anything. I'm just kind of stumped. I always have been. This will be a sign to you that you'll come here and worship at this mountain.
Yeah, very often you're going to find that kind of language being utilized to really emphasize that, number one, Moses he's not alone. He has divine guidance and protection. That's the important thing that is being emphasized there, much like the sign in Revelation 12, where the woman is not alone in the imagery there. In heaven, the woman is rather with the Godchild, with Christ. So you find that sign language used all over Scripture. The reason it's used here in particular is because you have a promise of a future worship at Sinai and the reassurance to Moses that the mission to deliver the Israelites is going to succeed precisely because it is God ordained. So that's why that particular kind of language is being used there.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Would you, wonderful gentlemen, be okay with about 25 minutes of Q&A? Any questions? We'll take a few questions before we wrap up. Would you all be okay with that? Wonderful. Great. We'll take a few questions. Let me look in the chat to see if anybody has sent any questions so far. Let me go upward. And for the audience that are tuning in, make sure to send your questions right now, and I'll allow you all see. I am trying to see if I can find anything. See anything? Okay. Well, I don't know what this question is. I don't know. I don't know why they asked this. What about the Shroud of Turin? I guess I'll get the thoughts of everybody here on the panel, what they think of the Shroud of Turin. Let me go with you, Father, first. Do you have, and if you don't want to talk about it, you don't have to. Father, do you have any particular thoughts about it?
No,
Yeah, I plead
that's
ignorance.
fine.
I don't know the latest discussion about it.
Okay. Go ahead, Father.
I think my first words are cautionary. I think a lot of people are looking for proof, and if the Shroud of Turin is real, oh my, that must mean that Jesus is real and things like that. And I really believe that while we have in our day and age things to which we can point that may be of supernatural origin or power or things like that. For example, we have weeping icons in our tradition. I still caution people about putting their huge faith and trust in something like the Shroud of Turin. Having said that, my own personal feeling is that it is a burial cloth of someone from the 1st century. And I think there are various, quite frankly, supernatural things about it in terms of its explanation as a as a shroud. There are some certain supernatural things about it that defy logic and explanation. It very well could be the burial cloth of our Lord, but it doesn't have to be the burial cloth of our Lord to believe that our Lord died and rose from the dead.
My bad, I was on mute. Great answer there, Father. And I know Bob says that he's not really looked into it. So let me go to John. John, do you have any particular thoughts on the Shroud of Turin? Real or you keep fraudulent?
No, I've killed a lot of brain cells since the last time I just wrote about that.
Oh, you wrote about it. Okay.
Well, no, it's in a book called Christianity and Science, and it's an edited compilation. And in it, there's a chapter on the Shroud of Turin by a leading paranormal detective in the atheist community, whose name escapes me right now.
Joe Nickel?
Yes. Now, if I had trouble remembering his name, I'm going to have trouble with the details. So, and if you're interested, I can send you that chapter and the chapter I mentioned about Jesus being the failed apocalyptic, and you can share it with the others if they want to read it.
Definitely. Subdeacon, do you have any particular thoughts on the Shroud of Turin?
So, in the Syriac tradition, there is something very similar. First, I want to say I believe in the shroud.
Yeah.
So, in the Syriac tradition, in the archives of the city of Edessa, in the earliest times attested to, you find the account of the king. It was a Roman vassal state, similar to Judea we talked about earlier. You find the king having a correspondence with Jesus of Nazareth, a back and forth between the king of Edessa and our Lord. And the representative of the king who meets Jesus in Judea makes a sketch of his face, something like this. And this is recorded in the archives. This was recorded in the archives of the city of Edessa at the time, and it was kept in the churches as a relic until eventually it was lost to history. So I think that the shroud is a very similar concept to this.
Wonderful, great. Let me go up. There was another question. Here it is. Palermo. And I guess we can go with Dr. Price first. In regards to the Didache, do you all agree with the scholarly consensus that it is a first century writing and that it quotes from Matthew extensively, as does Pope St. Clement of Rome? I know, Bob, you've done a good amount of work here. I probably know your answer, but go ahead and dive in, my friend.
Well, there's been a bunch of debate over whether the stuff in First Clement just parallels Matthew because of drawing on the same body of oral tradition, or whether it's actual quotes. And I just from my reading of it, I couldn't really say, but I mean, people have offered more detailed arguments than I can recall. But there's a problem with the dating of First Clement. Is it a unitary work? Because it goes on for 60 chapters. And also in its reference to the death of Peter and Paul, because of jealousy, this strikes me as implying that the work is from the 2nd century and that they're referring to the theme in virtually all of the apocryphal books of Acts that were Encretite and said you have to renounce sex even with marriage in order to be saved, and that the apostles were eventually martyred because the husbands or fiancés of women they persuaded to renounce sex to follow Jesus ratted them out to the local king, governor, or whatever, and they viewed these guys as gigolos and charlatans and put them to death. And this is, I mean, we don't know if that's true or not. I have no idea. But it sounds to me that that's the best guess as to why the author of First Clement, which is anonymous, by the way, it doesn't claim any author, it seems to me the best guess, which is all it is that it's referring to that strand of lore about the apostles, in which case First Clement would be a 2nd century work. Even if you don't think it's that late, there's a debate among even conservative scholars as to whether it's written before or after the temple, very similar to the debate about the Epistle to the Hebrews. And so I'm not sure. There's this interlocking group of debated points that I find it a little hard to sift through. Let's see. Oh, Didache, yeah. I've always read that scholars think it is either a 1st century or early 2nd century church manual, and I guess there's nobody feels that there are definite enough chronological links there to identify it. But I just always say late 1st, early 2nd century, and again, there are certain parallels to the Sermon on the Mount, but a lot of these sayings are paralleled among the rabbis or Stoic and Cynic philosophers, so it's hard to track it down or to tack it down, which is too bad because it would be very interesting and important to know.
John, do you have any particular comments on the Didache?
No, I don't. No.
Okay. Father, do you have any particular comments on the dating of the Didache?
1st century, probably later in the century, but certainly a 1st century document. Absolutely.
Subdeacon, would you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful, great. So,
go ahead. Is there any resurrection in the Didache? I just want to ask that. Just is there any mention of the resurrection, the bodily resurrection of Jesus in the Didache?
I think so. I think that there is. I'd have to go back and look at it. I don't know the Didache line.
Might be an early source. Okay.
We've got the Pope St. Clement of Rome clearly has the resurrection. I think that's earlier than the Didache. So you've got it there.
It's in chapter 16 of the Didache.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and it is quite early. Yeah, no doubt there. Now, perhaps we can go, Father or Subdeacon want to take this one first, and then we'll go around the table. If Daniel predicted the destruction of the temple, and that was obviously hundreds of years before, why does the temple destruction prophecy in the Gospels mean they were written after 70 AD?
I don't know. Good question. I think.
Well, I think there's assumption being made there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be made. We don't need to push the prophecy because there's an accurate prophecy. We don't. That's what I was trying to ask Mr. Loftus earlier. Mm-hmm. Because there's an accurate prophecy, we don't need to put the text after the date of the prophecy because it was accurate. We could just say, "Oh, they prophesied before the fact, and they were right." That's possible.
Yeah, it's possible.
Any comments on that, Dr. Price?
Well, I agree with John that it seems to me Daniel is actually a vaticinium ex eventu. That is, like the whole genre of apocalypses, like 4th Ezra and so on, which talks about a prediction of the fall of Jerusalem. It's actually post the fall of Rome. But these things always, they were trying to illustrate the providence of God that
I think Bob froze up there. Let's see. He usually freezes up and then he'll be back in a few seconds.
Well, maybe if you can hear me, I mean,
I can hear clearly. Yeah.
Apocalyptic prophets were a dime a dozen.
And it will turn out right eventually. So I think that was the idea. That it wasn't simply a bunch of lies. Put one over on.
Just like just like right now, there's a lot of people predicting the end of the world and the destruction of this and the
Namely, his
destruction
own
of that.
day. I'm sorry, I'm talking over somebody. I didn't even realize it.
You froze up there for a little bit there, Bob. You froze up for a little bit. You're back now.
Oh.
You froze up and John stepped in, but yeah, you're back now. Okay. Yeah. Let me see if we have any other questions. It looks like, we've got a lot of questions. Go ahead, Subdeacon. Go ahead, my friend.
I just was wondering, Father Jonathan, if you have anything about this, I'd want to hear your perspective.
Yes.
On Daniel and the writing of the Gospels. That was the question, William?
Correct.
Okay. The dating of the Gospels is a very fun parlor game. I tend to subscribe to the scholarship that I've read that and to the tradition of my own church that Matthew, Mark, Luke, John appear that way in the order of the New Testament because that's the order in which they were written. The earliest dating that I've read about Mark puts it to the early 60s, Luke at around the year 70, of course, John much later in the first century, Matthew also probably in the early 60s, or possibly even I read one place in the late 50s. Again, this comes down to who do you want to believe. But if Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written at or before the destruction of the temple, then that places the prophecies of Daniel in a whole new light.
Now, I would like to add about that. It seems to me that the destruction of Jerusalem was a pivotal moment in Jewish history, and that when Jeremiah in chapter 25 says that 70 years you'll be there and you'll come back, they didn't come back in 70 years, and so they had a problem with that. And so they were wondering about when the Messiah would come. All of a sudden, Messianic thinking started to generate, and it went down to Daniel. All of a sudden, people were thinking, well, where's these 70 years now? When's the Messiah coming? Why are we're going to restore Israel to its glory? And he says, no, it's not 70 years, but 70 weeks of years. And as you go through the Old Testament, the Apocrypha, you get down to Mark, and in his apocalyptic dialogue that Jesus gives, he says that it's about to happen. It's about to happen now. But that didn't happen now. Paul's predictions didn't happen now. And then all of a sudden in the book of Revelation at the very end, he says the time is coming. So they wrestled with this Messianic coming since the destruction of Jerusalem. That's what generated it. That's what originated. And it's still, being perpetrated by people who look for the restoration of the Davidic dynasty. And that's all there is to it. And we don't talk about the return of Jesus, and we don't see that in the New Testament. We see him talking about the coming of the Lord. So he's not talking about himself returning. He's talking about someone else. So there's always something more going on in that. And I'm going to send you that chapter to see what you think of what I have to say.
Yeah, I would really hope you write something on that. You're incorrect. The whole theology of the Son of Man is taken from the Old Testament, and the Son of Man ascends and descends, and he's very clear that he is going to return. He says it over and over. He's talking about himself, the Son of Man. It's not any other figure. And I would challenge that. We can look at the Greek. We can look at any scholarship, whether it be liberal or whether it be conservative. They may not agree with what we're saying as conservatives, but there is no doubt the Son of Man is Christ. And I've done a lot of work in this. In fact, I had a debate on this issue. Yes, I have.
Have you?
And of course, the man who ascended is going to come back is the same person, because even the angels in the gospel account told the disciples, do you see him ascending? In the same way he ascended, he will be descending. So the one who ascended is the one who descends. That's what the gospel says. Yep,
no doubt. But we are right around the 1 hour and 50-minute mark. I want to commend all of you all. I thought this was an incredible dialogue. I thought it was great. It was a lot of fun. I learned a lot from everybody here. I had a great time again. Yeah, we got to do it again. We got to definitely do it again. John, you were great. Dr. Price, you're a great father. You're a magnificent subdeacon as well. But before we wrap up, I want to, I keep my word all the time. I want to give you incredible gentlemen a chance to plug in your platform. You have a book coming out you want to point audiences to, a webpage, anything you want to plug in. And I'll let you go first, Bob, Dr. Price, then John, then Subdeacon, and I want to give Father the final word to plug in whatever he wants to plug in. Dr. Price, my friend, what are you working on? Where can people find you?
Well, I'm writing various shorter or longer articles for the Journal of Higher Criticism, and I have 3 short books under consideration at a publisher. One about whether Jesus and the early church were pacifists or not. Another one, a kind of Targum-like interpretive paraphrase of the Gospels by yours truly, and another one about the notion of the territorial spirits, which is a big deal in some circles, and the relation to the principalities and powers doctrine of the Bible. Then there's my huge book, Houses of the Holy, where I deal with not only the usual 5 world religions, but 7 more. And that's going to be pretty unusual and interesting, I think. Also, I have a 5-volume set in the works of the stories of all the fiction and a bit of the poetry of H.P. Lovecraft, and and a few other things, but I guess those are the biggies. Also, I host the Bible Geek podcast 4 days a week, Monday through Thursday, on the Wise as a Serpent channel. And every Saturday I do the Gnostic Sabbath at 4. The others are at 6 p.m., but this is at 4. And probably I'm doing a series of 8 sessions on the resurrection on the Bible Geek starting this Monday. So I'm keeping reasonably busy.
I can tell. Yeah. John, my friend, where can people find? Go ahead, my friend.
Your output is dizzying. Do you do that by voice text? I know initially you had to do a typewriter or a word processor, but do you do voice texting?
I just type it out on the computer.
Wow. Well, you're amazing, absolutely amazing. Now, all I want to do is point out one essay of mine that I mentioned at the beginning. I have 13 books. You can look me up. But after this talk, I might have to do a little revising of it.
Good.
We'll see.
Very good. John, where can people find you? Do you have a webpage? Do you have a blog?
Yeah, I have a Debunking Christianity blog. It's I wanted to get people's attention, and I realized it's really off-putting. And there's nothing I can do with that. And I have, you can find my books on there. Just John W. Loftus, look on Amazon or somewhere else, and you can find them. I have, if you go to my blog, though, Debunking Christianity, you'll see a list of my books, and I describe each one of them, give an outline, give you some of the recommendations that are about them and stuff. And Bob Price, by the way, he's written several chapters for me, which I'm excited about. Anytime I can get him to write for me something, anything, I love it. So,
wonderful.
So yeah, that's me. Yeah.
Subdeacon, my friend, put in a plug for anything you may be working on, webpage, YouTube channel, anything.
Yeah, I have my channel, The Lion's Den. It's just at youtube.com/@Daniel Kakish. I have a show coming up. It's actually a response to a Maronite subdeacon. He goes into the Syriac tradition a bit, which we both share, and I'm going to give our kind of perspective on that.
Wonderful, fantastic. Father, anything you would like to plug in? Webpage, blog, YouTube channel? The floor is yours right now.
Folks, take a look at my podcast, The Transfigured Life. We usually are dropping material every week or every other week on Friday around noontime. Although we just came out recently with our most recent podcast, I think came out today or maybe yesterday. It's really good stuff. We just got named by a couple of podcasters. It's one of the best new podcasts out there for Orthodox Christianity, and I'd love to invite everybody to come take a look. Thank you very much. God bless you all.
Definitely, and I hope that I really did fulfill the goal I wanted to fulfill. I wanted to make this a very diverse roundtable. With I think that when it comes to skepticism, atheism, I find it very difficult to find better than John and Dr. Price, who've done fantastic work. And I continue to promote their work because, as John knows and John laughs, his books have made my faith stronger. They sure have.
That's explainable. That's explainable by cognitive bias studies, by the way.
No. He once recommended a book to me that I read that he wrote. I loved it, and it really strengthened my faith, because you want to know why, for the audience? If the very best can offer that as their best argument, man, my faith is incredibly powerful. But I love these two guys. They're good friends. And so, Deacon, you're a near and dear brother. Father, you're incredible. You are the man. Thank you for joining us yet again. I look forward to it. Again, happy and Merry Christmas to everybody here. John, you be well, my friend. Dr. Price, Father, Subdeacon, we'll do it again. Definitely. You all have a great evening. Thank you, everybody.
You too.